Welcome, Shubham sir, on Khel Camera and Kanun. It's great to have you as a guest here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We have heard a lot about you and your work in sports, especially from a human rights point of view, and we are looking forward to a very meaningful conversation with you today.
Thanks so much, Ishaan. Thanks a lot for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation as well.
Thank you. To start off, can you tell us a bit about your journey, how you came to know about sports law, and then how were you able to narrow it down to a more human rights point of view and why this caught your attention?
Absolutely. So I think I've been working in this field for over 5 years now. The journey started with a specific article that I wrote in EPW, which was actually farther away when I was still an undergrad student about the sort of lack of representation of different caste groups in the Indian men's cricket team. That was way back in 2017. We did a few presentations based on that at a sports law policy symposium in India. And then it wasn't necessarily a plan to work in sports law after that. I worked for a couple of years after that, completed my LLM, and then worked for a couple of years in corporate law. And that's when I started to get in touch with sports again. When my law firm, we were representing some athletes as pro bono matters. And that was something that I really enjoyed. Uh, the thrill of sports law, the fact that you're working on these specific matters and with people that you hear in the news every day. And I also was feeling that I needed to get back to research
Right.
rather than work in corporate laws. So I ended my term with the law firm and then worked for a year with Sports and Society Accelerator in India on sports governance and policy. That is just when they were setting it up. And then I started my PhD about 3 years ago in Cambridge, where I'm working specifically on how differences in socioeconomic background impacts access to sport, which is, as you can imagine, directly arising from that EPW paper that I wrote earlier, focusing on cricket as a case study in three different jurisdictions, India, UK, and South Africa. So that's the sort of PhD which is hopefully going to finish in the next 6 to 8 months.
Okay.
And simultaneously, for the past almost 4 years, I've been working in sports and human rights, generally as a field, which is also my field. And in particular, I do a little bit of work with the Center for Sport and Human Rights
Okay.
and on various research policy initiatives. The most recent initiative that I'm a part of is the Climate Justice Initiative, and we can talk a bit about that later. But I've also worked with Fair Game in the UK, which is an organization that has advocated for the passage of the Football Governance Act, which was just a couple of weeks ago legislated and just improving the governance of football in this country. So yeah, have had many different experiences in governance, policy, law, law firms over the past 5 or 6 years, and all of them have sort of concretized my interest in sports, human rights, policy, climate, this sort of work.
That's a really interesting journey, sir. Uh, but as even as a law student or as a lawyer, I've never thought about the role of human rights or human rights policy with respect to sports. So when we say that somebody is working in that area, what exactly is your focus, or like what is the problem or the question that you're trying to solve there?
So my question in my PhD is more specifically around inclusion and diversity and inequity, which is how your privilege, your background impacts your ability to play sport or access sporting opportunities. And this varies significantly depending on the country, the place you are born with, the sport that you want to participate in, your gender, your race, your religion, so many different things. So to concretize that, for instance, who can play cricket in the UK, and the majority of the English cricket team historically has been very much focused and coming from private schools.
Hmm.
And historically, that has been the case. On the other hand, football is a much more working class game in the
Right.
UK, so
Right.
the makeup of the football team is quite different. So those are some of the issues that I'm looking at in my PhD. But when you think about sports and human rights more broadly, think of it as any human right that you can think about, right to speech, right to health, right to life, privacy, anything that you can think about, you will be able to think about a human rights issue. So for instance, if you think about right to privacy, you see a lot of data being gathered
Right.
on athletes like everyone else these days, and who has the right to own that data, who has the right to use that data, and whether athletes have that right, whether their teams have that right. So privacy issues there. Labor rights issues, something that has become very, very prominent in the last few
Right.
years, particularly all the surrounding spotlight around Qatar and the FIFA World Cup
Right. Yes.
2022. Migrant labor rights, but also other generally workers' rights in context of that, the kind of working conditions they were working in, the kind of health, lack of health measures that were put in place in relation to that. So right to life there, right to sort of labor rights there, right to health there, uh, right of local communities. When new stadiums are built, new events are happening at places, there's often a case of environmental degradation. Local communities face displacement, so you
Right.
have those rights associated with their livelihoods, with their lands. So those come in place. Right to speech, a lot of times issues around whether athletes can use their platform to voice out concern about certain issues that they feel strongly about, certain issues around injustice or anything else. So anything that you can think about in terms of when you think about human rights, you will find examples in sports, you will find examples of where those things are not working the way they are supposed to be. And in that sense, we see this often, and you'll keep hearing this often with people who work in this space. Sports is just a reflection of the society in some ways.
Right.
So whatever the ills and the goods and the bads are of the society, you will find them in one way or the other in sport. And the idea is to both think about how you can resolve these issues in the sporting context, but then also use the platform that sport offers to sort of show that the wider society can also resolve some of these issues, and think about approaches in ways in which the wider society can resolve these.
That's that's interesting and something to think about. I had a follow-up question, but just to go a bit off track. You mentioned about the freedom of speech, the right to say if you are not agreeing with a policy or something that's not wrong. Do you feel that this right, it's it's not violated as such, but to some extent it has been controlled and then incentivized in return by from a commercial point of view, especially for professional athletes? Do you think that this is the scenario right now?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's it depends on the context, right? And this varies. So whether an athlete, for instance, if we take the example of an athlete, whether they are unhappy with a particular situation in their sport, which is a matter of sports governance, which is a matter of sports regulation, or whether they are just sort of wanting to highlight an issue that is not necessarily directly a sporting issue, but something that they feel passionately about, and how and whether their sport or the event that they participate in controls their rights. So, for instance, somebody who is winning a gold medal at an Olympic and they want to use the platform of that podium to highlight a specific issue by wearing a certain badge,
Right, yes.
by holding a certain kind of flag. And a lot of these things have been restricted. The Olympic Charter places a restriction on that, for instance, in terms of what you can use that platform to highlight. And it is very much connected with the commerce in some ways, because there's also a lot of restriction on how much you can use your platform as an athlete to highlight your sponsors on a certain platform,
Right.
because it conflicts with other event rights or other sort of event organizer rights. So yes, speech is both commercial speech, which
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
I'll continue. Yeah, so it's both commercial speech and other speech. Both are restricted in different ways. Commercial speech because the organizers feel that they want to control the event to make sure that most of the wealth that is arising from the
Right.
event coming from sponsors come to them. But also other speech because event organizers and sports governing bodies, they are not very comfortable with uh, putting certain kind of views out there, and it's sometimes it's quite a lot of unfortunate, in the sense that you just feel like, why can't someone speak about that? That just
Right.
seems
Yes.
obvious. So it's a bit of a mixed thing, and sometimes it's just a bit ridiculous, to be honest, when
Right.
restrictions happen. But other times it can get a lot more political with different people placing different sort of values on both sides.
Absolutely. And do you think uh, uh, this restriction or this commercial aspect, this affects the sports governance as a whole? Like for example, the Indian wrestlers protest that happened a few months back. There, there were former athletes who were voicing their protests, and even current athletes. But again, there was a small portion of athletes who couldn't say, either because of government pressure, pressure from their own federation, or maybe from a commercial point of view. So, do you think this affects the governance policy and the governance structure as a whole?
Absolutely. I think if you look at sports governance, sports regulation policy, not just in India but across the world, a lot of it is self-governance and self-regulation, and a lot of it is something that operates in the gray zone. Uh, to begin with, they'll have like large restrictions, wholesale restrictions, or to say nothing. And then when some event happens, the organizer or the sports governing body will tell you that you cannot do this.
Right.
Or they will frame the restrictions in very wide terms that literally anything and everything
Right.
can be
Yes.
caught up by that and is restricted. And that's deliberate, obviously, right? Because then you can use that wide power that you give yourself to regulate, to
Mm-hmm.
prevent things that you don't want to happen. And this can play out in many ways, as you highlighted the example of the wrestlers' protest. There were some athletes who were very much out in the front, throwing away their medals, talking about their sacrifices for the country and the fact that they do not have safe working conditions. And athletes are workers, essentially, right? Especially at the elite level.
Right. Yes.
So the fact that they're not safe, the fact that they are harassed or abused, there's some who were trying to sort of support the other athletes who were out there in the front through their social media post or through interviews. There's some who did not speak out, and there are different sort of pressures applying on each of them in different ways, right? They could be pressurized from their sponsors that you cannot speak out on this issue, otherwise
Right.
we'll break away the sponsorship contract. Or they could be pressured because the people that they are protesting against, they control their future in some way or the other, in terms of selection, in terms of future spots on the team, in terms of funding. So the kind of pressures that are inherent and the kind of bargaining power or the lack of it that the athletes do enjoy or do not, all sort of make their way play out in this context. And that shows you in some way or the other the way in which regulation of sports works or does not work. It
Right.
works for some, it doesn't work for the vast
Right.
majority. And that is an excellent example of how that manifests.
Absolutely. Uh, so we discussed a number of issues that are currently in the sports industry. Other than these, do you see any specific or even more severe issue from a human rights perspective uh, that is prevalent not only in the Indian sports industry but the global sports industry, and something that is affecting growth of a specific sport? And if yes, then how can this issue be addressed?
I think for me, one of the biggest sort of issues globally in terms of sports governance is around accountability and remedy. And this is a human rights issue, but also a wider issue than just human rights, which is that because, as we spoke about earlier, sports is largely self-regulated in many different contexts. And even after the
Right.
passage of the new National Government Act in India, there'll still be a large element of self-regulation because of the concept of the autonomy of sports, right? Um, but because of this self-regulation, what happens is that sport bodies take a lot of power with themselves, and there is very little that is left in terms of anybody who is aggrieved or who is
Right.
hurt or who is harmed or abused by any action, inaction, or policy of the sports body, but also any action within that sporting ecosystem framework. At an event, somebody abused them, they did not get the right amount of treatment at a particular event, or they felt unsafe, or they felt that there was corruption involved in selection or any sort of issue that any athlete or any other stakeholder, for instance, it could be a
Right.
coach, it could be a worker, it could be an official support staff, even fans, the way they are mistreated or not well treated in stadiums, for instance. So these various stakeholders, any kind of issues that they have with the governance structures, who can they reach out to sort of seek remedy for their grievance?
Right.
And that is, I think, one of the fundamental issues, that there is lack of accountability because of a sort of blurred line of responsibility in some ways, right?
Right.
Because who is responsible? Is it the event organizer? Is it the sport
Right.
body? Is it the local government? Is it the national government? Uh, is it collective responsibility in some ways? Once the
Mm.
event gets over, the organizing committee is disbanded, right?
Right.
Then
Yes.
who do you reach out to? So this blurred line of responsibility, which is deliberate in some ways because it helps you evade responsibility. So I think accountability is one of the biggest fundamental issues, and with lack of accountability, there is lack of remedy because you don't even know who to approach, who to complain to, who to complain against,
Right.
and whether your complaint will even be heard in the first place, whether it would be heard in an independent, fair, efficient, fast manner.
Right.
And what is the remedy in the end? You get compensation? Would you get remedy in terms of a promise that this will not happen again? If there is a criminal act involved, whether this person will be punished? So the lack of accountability and the lack of remedy, I think, is one of the fundamental big issues globally and not just in India.
Absolutely. So it's a big issue. And when we say about accountability, uh, I think it's not only limited to human rights. Another
Yeah.
issue that needs a big point of accountability is the climate, the impact of sports in climate, because we saw somewhat. For the first time I heard the word greenwashing during the Qatar Football World Cup, and then recently F1 changed their 70-30 model to 50-50, where earlier 70% of the power used to come from the engines and 30 from the battery, but now 50% from the engine and 50% from the battery, which most of the teams are protesting, or they're saying this will impact the sports. And F1 said that this is because of the environment impact that the vehicles do. So, what is your take on the impact of sports on climate, and especially with the immense level of commercialization of sports? So, sports event is no longer the main event. It is a part of a bigger event where there are multiple pre and post events around a sports event. So, how do you see the impact of on climate regarding this?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ishaan, for this question. And it's one of my sort of primary areas of interest right now, which is also part of my PhD and something I'm working separately as well. So I think to think about sports and climate, you first need to think about the bidirectional relationship between sports and climate, in the sense that sports, as opposed to many other industries, and if you think of it as an industry, is heavily dependent on climate, right?
Right,
Most sports, most big events are played in the outdoors,
right,
and they need to be played in a certain specific ambient outdoor temperature, ambient
right,
outdoor
yes,
conditions. You need to have a day where there is sunlight, where there is good quality air, where there is not rain. Cricket, for instance, one of the games that is, we are probably most passionate about. I see the Dhoni shirt behind you. Uh, Even the toss is dependent on the climate, right? It's so dependent. The pitch conditions, the ground conditions, it's the sport that is stopped as soon as rain starts happening. So an ambient sort of climate in multiple ways, your rain, your water availability, your clouds, your temperature, everything depends on the climate. So sport is heavily dependent on climate, is something that we need to be aware about, and we need to realize and we need to acknowledge. And I don't think anybody can object to that.
right,
But then think about the bidirectional relationship between sports and climate. One is that sport itself impacts and contributes to climate change and the climate crisis, right? Because uh, all the sports events, they involve a lot of traveling, a lot of construction, a lot of event organization, a lot of wastage arising out of events because of all the consumption. So in all that sense, sport is a heavy contributor to the climate change. If sport were a country, it would be amongst the top 20 to 25 contributors to climate change in the world. Carbon emissions almost equivalent of that of a country like Poland or Spain, which is significant, right?
Right.
So that is one thing to realize, which is that sports contributes to climate change, and not just climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also environmental degradation. So impact on nature, as
Right.
I said, because of the construction and all those things, right? And then other side, which is that sports is getting impacted by the results of the climate crisis, because temperatures are rising, pollution, air quality is getting worse, there are floods, there are
Right.
extreme weather events, wildfires, rainfall, all those things impact sport events and whether they can happen or not. We're already seeing impacts of this in many different parts of the world. The calendar is getting reduced in which sports can happen. Winter sports are facing an existential threat
Right.
because the amount of snow is reducing in many places. Sport fields are getting flooded due to rainwater, due to hurricanes and cyclones. A lot of sports is actually grounds in many parts of the world are located near floodplains, near sea coastal areas. So those are getting flooded. Extreme weather events, whether you can even play sports in this sort of temperature. And again, if we come back to cricket, uh, it's a sport that is heavily impacted due to climate because
Right.
especially if you're batting, you wear those high padded clothing, right? With the
Correct. Yes.
pads and everything else. And that reduces the ability of the body to be able to operate optimally in a high temperature. And even half a temperature variation makes a massive, massive difference. It has impact on your health. It has impact on the ability of your body to respond to it. So life, right to life implication. Uh, it has impact on your performance even, right? If it's not the optimum sort of level, you
Right.
cannot
Yes.
perform well. We have seen changes in the times that different events start. Right now Asia Cup is going on cricket, and we saw that the start time of
Right.
the
Yes.
matches
Yeah.
was varied because of the heat. We have seen so many variations in marathon starting times in recent Olympics because of heat. So sport is getting impacted, and it's not just the athletes, which has been a bit of a focus recently. If you look at the global level, athletes definitely are the focus of it, which is great, but also other stakeholders, right? The fans within the stadiums, whether they have ability to drink regularly water, enjoy some sort of cooling effects within the stadium, the support staff that is helping the players, the
Right.
workers who are working at the players. So everybody who is associated with sport in one way or the other is getting impacted. And training sort of schedules have to be changed. The pitch conditions, right? If it's a drought prone region and you're diverting the water from there to the management of the field and keeping it just the right amount of quality so that sport can be played, what that does to the availability of water for the local community. A
Right.
few years
Yes.
ago, you might remember that India was touring Cape Town. There's a water crisis
Right.
in Cape
Yes.
Town. There's also an issue around IPL in Maharashtra a few years
Right.
ago
Yes.
when the
Yes.
whole drought conditions were happening, and the stadium in Pune was getting all the water, and then local
Correct.
communities were facing drought conditions. So it also has that impact, and this is something that has not been acknowledged quite a lot. The wider impacts of sports and the climate crisis and how it impacts the rights of the people, rights of athletes, rights of fans, rights of workers, but also rights of local communities. So there is a bit of a justice element to it. And obviously, in any matter of inequity, there is always some people who are more vulnerable, some people who are more exposed, and some
Right.
people who are better or worse adapted. They have the resources to adapt or not. And
Right.
again, richer places, richer sort of sports will be able to adapt better. Poorer places, more deprived places, which again increases the gulf in the inequity and the access to sports that I was talking about earlier.
Correct.
So in that sense, there is a lot needs to happen, a lot of acknowledgement that this is a problem and a lot of response that needs to happen. But one thing that I would like to mention is F1 that you pointed out.
Right.
You would think that F1 is a very polluting sport, but in fact, F1 is not the most polluting sport as much as you can think about it.
Okay.
And specifically, the race itself and the running of the cars is
Right.
actually contributes to less than 2% of the carbon emissions of F1 as a sport, the running of the
Okay.
race itself. and the carbon emissions of the cars themselves.
Right.
The vast amount of F1 carbon emissions comes from the logistics, the
Right. Yes.
all the transfer of the cars and all the equipment from one race to another, but also the fan travel and the official travel, because a lot of official travel is business class and that is much more carbon intensive.
Right.
And
Yes.
most of the emissions in any kind of sport is around travel, fan travel and official travel. So
Right.
as you said, growth, right? Whether what is the impact of the growth, and which is where I think it's important to think that progress and growth are not necessarily the same thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
You need a 64 team World Cup, and or whether a 32 or a 48 team World Cup is the right thing to do. Whether expansion of events, pre-tournament, post-tournaments, flying teams flying out for one match across the globe, or are these things necessary? Are these things worthwhile? So the commercial imperative and the planet. So the planet versus profit. I think recently it's a lot of the profit over the planet,
Right.
but that cannot continue. It cannot just, and somebody needs to take accountability and
Absolutely.
responsibility for that. I spoke for too long on this.
It's it's nice to know more about such topics which are not much talked about. Again, a controversial take is because of the commercial sports lobby. They do not want to discuss this at the large scale because again there might be a backlash from the fans at the end of the day if the environment and the climate are being affected. So it's nice to know about this. So how do you think this? Uh, so, for example, a couple of months back, it was announced that a country like Thailand, which is still an emerging market, it's a developing country, they have been added to the F1 roster. And Thailand is already working on its carbon credit system, where they'll be able uh, to some extent, work on the carbon emissions and how to deal with that. Uh, and Thailand itself is a much traveled place, so they already have a large footprint. So how do you think developing countries who are trying to build their economy on the foundation of sports, how can they deal with this issue? And so what is the solution? So this is a big problem, but is there a solution? And if yes, then what?
Yes, absolutely. I think the solution starts from acknowledging the issue and acknowledging not just that this is a climate issue, but also think about it's a very existential issue for sports, right? Because if the planet degrades at the
Right,
rate that which it is degrading, both in terms of climate and environment, sport is something that will be first and fundamentally affected. Because if you do not have the right amount of environment to play sports, where will you play and when will you play, right?
right,
So you can, in the short term, maybe put profits above the planet and the people, but long term it will affect. So sports and the business of sports need to recognize and acknowledge that it is a very much fundamentally self-existential issue and very much something that they need to tackle to sort of serve their own sort of commercial purposes, right? So there is very much an alignment there. And yes, obviously, now the question becomes how do you sort of grapple with the issues around development and the issues around taking these events to new places and exposing new people to it. And it's great that that can happen, but then you need to find some innovative and creative approaches to it, right? So, if new places want to host F1 races, absolutely no problem there. But then the question is whether the calendar needs to increase from 22, 23 races to 25, 26 races,
right,
or
yeah,
whether we can follow a rotation policy, Uh, Thailand one year, Shanghai next year, and they
right,
alternate between each other. So circuits in the same part of the world, they maybe alternate every 2, 3 years or every year, so that the overall calendar remains sort of stable and sort of manageable, for instance. And I think F1 has worked a lot in recent years on rationalizing the calendar so that there's not a lot of back and forth between races in North
right,
America or Europe and Asia. So it's much more streamlined now. It follows a more sort of linear approach.
right,
Still, it could be better. They've worked a lot. Right now, all the Asian races are compacted together, all the North American races, not all of them, but most of them.
right,
So those things are needed, for instance. And I think the biggest thing is around fan travel, right? Do you need people from America to fly down for races in Australia or South Asia, or whether you would restrict fans within a local sort of catchment zone, and make it a more sort of local event in that sense. So that could reduce a lot of fan travel, which can go a long way in reducing carbon emissions. But the biggest issue is, I think, as I said, you need to think about the people and the rights of the people who are being impacted. So whether a new track is required, because a new track will mean a lot of environmental degradation, people getting displaced, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So those things need to be thought about, and also co-organizing races, right? If you have a track in two different countries which are nearby, even if the races alternate between them, they are co-organizers of that event. So they take
Correct.
out the benefits and they put in them. So you can have a lot of these innovative, creative approaches, but need to tackle every different aspect of it, the people, the profit, the planet. And you also need to think about how you can work with different stakeholders, particularly the people who are most impacted, hear them, what they want, how they want it.
Correct.
And the most and the best events are one which are co-organized or co-created with the local people in certain ways where they feel
Absolutely. Yes.
involved with the part of the culture. And those things need to happen, not just in the climate context, but in the wider sort of sports governance space. Involvement of the local people and getting them on board, and the event leaving a positive sort of socio-economic cultural legacy for them. I think that's the most fundamental sort of reason they tray of sports events in some ways, right? It should be for the local people in the community because
Absolutely.
they're the most impacted, so they
Right.
should have the most benefit out of it.
Okay. Thank you for a comprehensive and easy to understand response. How do you think the future of human rights in sports would be? And with the new National Sports Governance Act that has come, do you think there will be a higher level of focus on human rights uh, for Indian athletes, or do you think the act does not deal with this and a separate regulation or a separate policy will be needed to cater to this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Ishan, for that question. I think it's great. The new Sports Governance Act is, of course, a very positive and forward-looking step. There are different elements, and obviously, this has to be read with the sports policy, which was also released not too long ago, just a couple of weeks before the act. I think there are different provisions in both the act and the policy that could be called as human rights provision. So the provision for athletes committees, for instance, the provision for athlete representation in decision making, representation of women in decision making, safe sport, uh, and similar sort of few other provisions, so which are not explicitly referred to as human rights provisions, which is absolutely all right, but which are forward looking, which are athlete focused. So they are great, absolutely. But I think obviously the act does not do everything that I would have
Right.
liked, or was on my wish list, for instance. But there is a lot of scope for the national regulator that will be formed under the act to deal with those issues. So, for instance, as I mentioned, it's not just athletes that we need to take care, but also the wider ecosystem
Right.
stakeholders,
Yes.
the support staff, the fans, the coaches, the workers, and everybody else who is in one way or the other associated ecosystem. So that broadening of decision making, broadening of accountability, broadening of stakeholder engagement needs to happen at that level. Uh, then the other way is obviously the act is much more bare bones in some ways,
Correct. Yes.
which is usually more in terms of accountability and remedy, as I mentioned earlier, could be helpful in the future. There's also something that I would have liked, which is not there, is recognition that athletes are workers, especially at the elite professional
Right.
level, because that recognition helps in making sure that there is less difficulty in ascribing and adopting of rights.
Right.
So, for instance, things like athletes' unions, which is something that doesn't happen at all in Indian sports, but is something that is very big in many other jurisdictions, that needs to happen, that athletes should have the ability to form unions and collectively bargain for their rights.
Correct.
But Inevitably, I think human rights in Indian sports will be incorporated in different levels sooner rather than later, especially because a lot of these reforms are with a view to make India a great potential host for the 2036 Olympics, which
Right.
is not a secret at all, as we all know. So, given that that is the overall sort of medium-term objective that we are going with, IOC has a human rights policy,
Okay.
which is very detailed, very specific. It's called the IOC Strategic Framework on Human Rights. IOC has a sustainability policy. IOC has safeguarding policies. So there are several frameworks which are sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, sustainability, safeguarding, uh, governance, these frameworks that IOC have adopted, and inevitably, as and when India becomes sort of more focused on that 2036 bits, but also the various events that potentially will happen before that, the 2030 Commonwealth Games, for
Right.
instance,
Right.
India has put up and is in running along with Nigeria. World Athletics Championships, military games, para championships, different sort of sports events. All of them will need to comply with the regulations of the international sports bodies, and most international sports body uh, have, in one way or the other, these requirements that
Mm-hmm.
need to be complied with, both in
Right.
a sort of domestic governance setup, but also in relation to that event. So, in that sense, those things will need to be included specifically. And it will be adoption of policies, it will be formation of action plans,
Right.
implementation, and sort of monitoring. So, all those things will come in. Uh, it's better if we sort of take a forward step and get them in sooner rather than later, so that we start building that culture of safe, responsible sports without sort of trying to do it because somebody is imposing it from the outside. Because this is just the right thing to do, right? There is no other way about it. This is
Right.
what needs to happen. So that will happen. Whether it happens because we take the forward step or whether it happens because we have to do it,
Right.
that is the only question that needs to be sort of answered, and we'll see what happens. I hope it's that we do it because it's the right thing to do, and it happens sooner rather than later. We have seen some right steps, so hopefully more will come alongside it. We also saw the National Human Rights Commission of India organize an event on safe sport last year,
Okay.
which was the first such government level event that I know of. So yeah, those things are happening, and more of those things with the right amount of independence for the bodies, with the right amount of accountability and transparency. I think those are very important things, and I see them happening sooner rather than later.
That's nice. And and you said that a number of good steps or initiatives have been taken up, but with respect to India, where there's somewhat a dearth of resources, sorry, a lack of resources on the development of the sport. Do you think authorities will prefer diverting the funds uh, on conducting maybe sensitization issues instead of developing the sports? If yes, do you think corporate bodies can use their CSR funds to finance such events or finance maybe a capacity building program focusing on human rights? And if yes, then how should it be structured?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it has to be a whole of ecosystem and stakeholder approach. In that sense, no one body, no one entity can go about doing this because it's a complex exercise, it's a nuanced exercise, and it's a sensitive exercise. And this needs to happen with the wider sort of reforms, right? Which is why this is the right time when those things need to be incorporated within the
Right,
frameworks, because you cannot suddenly decide 3 years or 4 years down the line, or just 1 year before your deadlines are from the IOC, for instance, or any other body, that this is a requirement of our host contract, so we need to do this.
right,
That will be a problem, because if that happens, then these things might only happen on the top as a show exercise rather than a real exercise.
right,
So if, and ideally that should be the idea, right? That you do this so that these things get embedded and these things become part of the culture. And that can only happen when you start thinking about these from the word go and building with the overall infrastructure. We have the focus on manufacturing that is coming up in the recent weeks, focus on
Correct. Yes.
reduction in GSTs recently. So everything is happening with that objective of making the sports industry and the sports ecosystem more viable and more productive, both from the elite sports perspective, but also from the grassroots sports perspective. So all of this needs to happen together. And yes, we can talk about the fact that there's a resource crunch, or not everybody can do it, which is why this needs to happen together. Like, you don't need every single sport body to do these individually. These
Right.
potentially the guidelines, the frameworks can come from the regulator, which will be formed under the act, the National Sports Board, whatever. uh, and it's not that they need to do a lot of work around this, right? Because the mega frameworks are already available from international bodies. IOC has set
Correct.
up a framework. FIFA, big international bodies all have different frameworks and guidances available for national regulators, for national sports bodies and event organizers. So the main thing is to sort of take what has already been done, do not reinvent the wheel,
Right.
see what the best practices are at the international level in different countries, different events, different organizations, see what needs to be adapted in the Indian local context,
Right.
and then apply them and then reiterate them, because some things will work, some things will not work. So be flexible about it, reiterate it, worked with other sort of organizations. So different sports bodies in India don't necessarily need to have different policies or
Correct. Yes.
different bodies taking care of these issues. You could have a common sort of frameworks, common sort of bodies responsible for this, for training, for formation, for dispute resolution, for accountability, remedy, grievance redressal.
Right.
So all these things can be common, which means resource sharing, which means more expert capacity building, which means more efficiency into the system. And yes, obviously, fundings can come out of the CSR fund of corporates, from any kind of other entity, from the market, from the civil society, from the government, from the sports bodies. So it needs to be an overall integrated, intersectional approach, building with the people and for the people. So there is enough sort of funding availability. I don't think funding is necessarily an issue in terms of
Okay.
getting this done, because this needs to happen with everything else. Like, you are reforming your governance boards, because now you'll have to comply with the requirements of the new act in terms
Right.
of what is the board look like. So this needs to happen simultaneously. Alongside that, you need to have a safeguarding policy, or you need to adopt certain ethical sort of requirements as well in terms of preventing of conflict of interest. So all of these things can happen together, which avoids duplication, avoids wastage of resources. So with the
Right.
right will and the right sort of nuance, and
Right.
and in India, we do jugaad. So
Right.
that
Yes.
is the idea. Jugaad in the right spirit,
Right.
which means that you don't need to waste resources or hide behind lack of resources. That
Correct.
need not be the case and doesn't need to happen. If the intent is right, these things can happen very easily, and there is expertise available. There are existing frameworks available, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It can happen very
Absolutely.
easily.
Absolutely. One of the basic rights that you discussed in the beginning of the session was privacy. And with the rise of social media, privacy has actually become a myth because everything is out in the public. So with in future or from now onwards, with sports policy being strengthened to protect policy, how do you see AI, sports policy, and social media, or for that matter, even mainstream media? How do you see these working together and ensuring that athletes' privacy is protected, especially where media houses or even social media handles, they like exploiting the athlete's image or an event for their own commercial benefits.
That is a million-dollar question, isn't it? And actually, it's so, because there's a lot of commerce involved with this. I think at the beginning of this sort of conversation, what needs to happen is the recognition that at the end of the day, athletes are the biggest sort of assets for any kind of sport, because they are
Right.
the ones who bring out the sponsors. They are the one who is bringing in the revenue, the broadcasters, the fans. The athletes are the stars, right? And it is athlete data in one way or the other, any kind of health data, performance data, or their sort of social media presence, their personal lives, their professional life. So it needs to start from that space that athletes are the ones who are creating it. Athletes are the ones
Mhm.
who should be the owners of it, right? So once you start from that baseline, then you think about how you can work with the athletes to best monetize the data for the athletes, but also for the
Right.
wider sort of stakeholders. So athletes need to have that right and control and ownership of the data. And then sort of think about with them, through them, how their rights can be protected. What is it that they're comfortable sharing? What is it that they're comfortable sharing with the public, with the commercial entities who want to exploit the data? What is it that they're getting in return?
Right.
And what sort of share of that goes to the sports body or the other stakeholders involved? So again, if you do a top-down approach where you just impose certain kind of conditions on athletes and you exploit that, then you will have some kind of a protest or a revolt or a breakdown in the system sooner rather than later. You'll have dispute resolution, cases getting stuck in the litigation endless
Right.
system, and it doesn't benefit anyone. So if you start from that approach that they are the stars, they are the people who are the owners, and then you build the system with them,
Mhm.
then I think that would be the best approach,
Right.
both in terms of social media, other media, their privacy, their data. All of these need to happen with the athletes, and obviously AI. Again, with it, like with anything else, it's a tool, right? And
Right.
you need to
Yes.
find out best ways in which it can be used so that there is no abuse, there is no harm, but you can use it to engage with the fans, to sort of improve fan experiences, to improve safety, to improve so many different things. So it should be that harnessing of that power of the AI, right? You mentioned resource crunch earlier. So just
Right.
use the AI as a tool to sort of get over that barrier of resource crunch in some ways, because there are a lot of things that AI can do instead of doing some of the work that could be resource intensive. And then
Correct.
you bring in the experts and build systems and the frameworks with the experts.
Thank you. Thank you. Now coming to the last section of the episode, I wanted to understand, like you started, like you worked at Linklaters. Now you are a PhD scholar. So how has your perspective of sports law changed? Maybe when you were a student, when you were working at Linklaters, and now that you are pursuing your PhD, like has it changed at like considerably, or is it the same? How has your understanding of the sports law changed in these three different phases?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when I was starting out in this space and trying to understand this field, and I'm a lawyer by training, all my sort of life, my undergrad, my master's, my PhD, all in the law departments of different universities. So I think at that point of time, the focus was very much on law and what can
Right.
law do and what cannot law do, and trying to figure out legal loopholes or legal interpretations which can lead you to the sort of situation that you want to, or sort of figuring out what the law is.
Right.
So I think one of the biggest things for me is to understand that law, like anything else, is a tool, is a social system in its own ways. So which means that it has its benefits, it has its powers, but it also has its limitations. So I think that has been one of the key sort of takeaways, is that law is powerful in some respects, but law also has limitations.
Right.
So there is only so much that law can do in relation to changing the culture of a place, right? You can have
Right.
the best sort of legislation, best act, but if you do not have other sort of systems working alongside it, changing the architecture of the place, changing the norms, changing the market conditions, and changing the incentives for different parties, sort of changing a whole sort of cultural approach to
Right.
things, then there's only so much that law can do. So it's that understanding and realizing that, and sort of working in and thinking about things from a more sort of interdisciplinary perspective, thinking about the societal conditions, the political economy of things,
Right.
how the politics impact a particular space, how the economic imperatives impact a space. So that has been vital in understanding. The other is obviously, I think, when I was pursuing my undergraduate degree, and even after that, at the master stage or at the corporate law firm. The mindset was very client focused and very sort of corporate law focused, which is what most sports law is about from
Right.
my sort of conversations with various sports lawyers in different contexts. But I think as I have worked in the governance space, in the regulation space, and the human rights space, I've realized that that is one side to look at, but there's also the sort of side of people who don't necessarily have a voice, but who
Right.
are impacted by events or sports in different ways. And sports is an emotion in many different ways, right? So
Correct. Yes.
even if you're not directly associated with it, you are getting impacted. If the right kind of event is not being held, and then the fan even sitting at the home who is not necessarily directly going to the stadium, even they feel the difference, right?
Correct.
If
Yes.
somebody is getting impacted, like somebody's being abused, facing allegations as a wrestler's protest, that has an impact on the fans as well. That has an impact on the trust in the system.
Right.
And it's very important to maintain trust in the system, which means that the system needs to function for everyone. So those realizations, I think, are newer in the last few years as I've worked more in this space, that everybody needs to feel a certain kind of respect and safety and trust with the system. The
Absolutely.
fact that they are heard to, that they are cared about. Uh, so that has been a bit of a change, and obviously with me looking at climate space recently, now it's also about the sort of justice angle, the climate justice piece, the climate inequity, and then planet, and how, as I said, the natural environment is a fundamental sort of backbone of most of sports, especially outdoor sports, right?
Right.
So that becomes really, really important, and nobody in India is right now paying attention towards that. So that needs to change quite a lot. So yeah, those things have been new, and new sort of ways in which people think about that. That has
Right.
been quite a revelation.
That's an interesting trajectory. Last question. Any words of wisdom or any advice to junior lawyers, law students who want to build a career in this field but are not aware of how to do this? Uh, because when I was a law student, I came to know about sports law in my fourth year, first semester, but I was not aware of anything, and I had to rely on Western literature, foreign country lawyers, and that is how I understood about sports law. And the purpose of this podcast series is to help the athletes and the legal fraternity. So, any advice, any words of wisdom for our junior lawyers and students?
I would say, I mean, just figure out what interests you in some ways or the other, and uh, there's always that potential to sort of build your own niche or build your own sort of specific perspective to it. So for me, it was about sort of, I came to this thinking about inequity and thinking about lack of access.
Right,
And that's how I found my niche in working on those topics, in working on human rights topics.
right,
And I think a lot has changed since we were students, in that sense of how much information is available on the internet
absolutely,
about these issues. And even from an Indian context, I think a lot, especially with the passage of the new act and in the past year or so with the focus on 2036, etc. So particularly from a sports angle, I think a lot is happening right now. You can do whatever in whatever field you are interested in. And it's one thing to important to realize about sports is, yes, there is something called sports law or lex sportiva, which is internal sporting rules.
right,
But sports law more broadly, so lex sportiva is more sort of internal rules, but sports law is just any other law in the sporting context, right? If
correct,
you
yes,
are
yes,
engaging in a contract, but it involves an athletes, then that's just sports law.
right,
So you could come to it, but also the most fundamental thing is to be interested in what you're really doing, and then you can find always a sporting angle to it. As I said, you can pick any human right, and I'll be able to give you an
right,
example of how that is implicated in the sporting context. You can think of any field, and it's not just true for lawyers, but anybody who is working anywhere, if they are at all interested in sports, I'm confident that they will be able to find one way or the other in which they can get associated or contribute. There are psychologists, there are nutritionists, there are engineers, there are management. Every field, if you are interested in sports at all, you will be able to find some or the other niche. I think the point is to find that niche, find what really interests you, and then just figure out who are the people
Right.
working in that, make conversations with them, figure out the literature, read vociferously. I think that really helps.
Right.
So yeah, and just build your knowledge base, be curious, ask questions, and then talk to the right people. And yeah, if you really want to work in it, I think there is no sort of right way to approach. It's just being figuring out what unique you can bring and how that
Right.
they can help people. And I think that's all that is.
Thank you, sir. Thank you again for joining the session. It was really nice talking to you. I'm sure I learned a lot of things, and I'm sure our audience will learn a lot of things, especially coming from a person who has worked at different levels from a different point of view. I'm sure this conversation will help everybody who listens to it. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you so much, Ishan. It has been a lovely conversation. Thank you for the invitation and for organization. Great to speak to you. Thanks a lot.